Good evening, and thank you, Yuri. Thank you, all the organizers of this evening, and Professor Leo Bilski. I would like also to thank the German Ministry of Justice for exhibiting this important traveling exhibition based on the comprehensive research study known as the Rosenberg Act, the Rosenberg Files. The initiative of the Federal Justice Ministry in 2012 to investigate how it coped with the Nazi past was similar to initiatives of other ministries, such as the German ministries, such as in agencies, such as the Foreign Office, the Federal Criminal Police, and the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. One of the main questions that all these studies dealt with was the extent of the integration of former Nazis and Third Reich officials into these offices and its consequences. The conclusions were almost the same. The Federal Ministry of Justice, like all other ministries in the new democracy of West Germany, recruited and reemployed ex-Nazis, usually without investigating their dark past during the Nazi era. The reinstatement process was part of the general policy for the past, Vergangenheitspolitik, to use the phrase coined by the historian Norbert Frey. In my short lecture, as a historical introduction to the exhibition, I would like to discuss some of the main characteristics of this policy, the policy of amnesty and integration. It related to the avoidance of bringing Nazi criminals to justice by German law enforcement system, giving amnesty to Nazi criminals who were convicted in Allies trials, and the integration of former hardcore Nazis, including criminals and ex-Third Reich officials, into the democratic West Germany administration. In recent years, I have studied the bilateral contacts between Israel and West Germany in the formative years of the two states against the background of West Germany's problematic attitude in those years towards its Nazi past. Thus, I would like to begin my lecture. I would like to begin my lecture with an episode in Bonn in the summer of 1961. It can illustrate the complex situation of ex-Nazi integration, in a way, even the cruel irony of history. When Nazi perpetrators, 15 years after the Holocaust, negotiated as high West German officials with representatives of Israel. At the beginning of June 1961, the head of the Israeli purchasing mission in West Germany, Felix Schenauer, met with the high German official Karl Friedrich Veolan, a special economic advisor to Chancellor Adenauer. They met to discuss the first installment of a German loan to Israel that Chancellor Adenauer promised to Prime Minister Ben-Gurion during their historic meeting in New York in 1960. Schenauer probably didn't know that the polite official who showed goodwill and tried to help Israel had a giant skeleton in his closet. During the war, as a senior functionary in the Baltic states and in Belarus occupied territories, he confiscated the property of the murdered Jews. So the same person who in August 1942 instructed his subordinates in a bureaucratic fashion to mark the confiscated Jewish property dealt 15 years later with making promised loan to Israel available. The dark past of Karl Friedrich Veolan became known to the public during one of the well-known trials of Nazi criminals that took place in West Germany at the beginning of the 60s. The trial of Georg Heuser, the head of the criminal police of Rheinland-Pfalz. During the war, among other murder missions, he served as an SS officer in a Sonderkommando B1 of the Einsatzgruppe in the Baltic states. Heuser, joining the criminal police of the state of Rheinland-Pfalz, is a senior inspector and his rapid promotion testify to the unbearable ease with which criminals succeeded in the process of denazification. Statements from police officers, Heuser's colleagues of course, about his impressive abilities were enough for a person behind many murders in the East to be accepted into a senior position in the police service. As noted, the uncritical nature of the recruitment and the reinstatement process that led to the employment of former hardcore Nazis and loyal officials of the Third Reich, and even perpetrators, was a phenomenon that crossed professions and sectors in West Germany. One of the researchers' conclusions from the Rosenburg files was that most important criteria at the beginning of the 50s for being selected for a post in the Ministry of Justice were a specialist competence and the ministerial experience. The political burden of the past were much less significant. Going back to Georg Heuser's case, the findings about his dark past were one of the first success of West Germany Federal Bureau for the investigating of Nazi crimes. It began to function by the end of 1958 from Ludwigsburg near Stuttgart and became known by its abbreviation, the Zentrale Stelle, the central office. The establishment of the Zentrale Stelle was a joint decision of the Ministers of Justice of West Germany federal states in collaboration with the Federal Minister of Justice at that time, Fritz Schäfer. Several trials of Nazi war criminals conducted in Germany in 1958 triggered these decisions. Documents and testimonies showcased in these trials revealed atrocities and mass murders executed by Germans who had succeeded in evading indictment. In the revelations during the 1958 trials, the Germans who committed severe crimes lived peacefully and even succeeded in developing prestigious career, intensified criticism in Germany and abroad regarding the disregard of German judiciary, particularly the German prosecutors to Nazi crimes. Historians commonly accept the thesis that the general reluctance of German society during the 50s to face up to its Nazi past had considerable influence on German legal authorities' avoidance of dealing with Nazi crimes, bringing war criminals to justice. It was one of the outcomes of the so-called the Wall of Silence, Mauer des Schweigens, in the Federal Republic Society under the leadership of Adenauer that they built around the Nazi period. Those who called upon the Germans to come to terms with their past pointed out that the murders are living among us. They further emphasized that those who were behind the scene of the atrocities and the final solution, the so-called the Hintermänner, are living a peaceful life as part of the West German bureaucracy. An Israeli diplomat stationed in Cologne by the end of the 50s as part of the Israeli purchasing mission expressed his perception in a report to Jerusalem. He wrote that today ex-Nazis hold many key positions in the administration and the judiciary. They make up a large part of the educational system, particularly among high school teachers. One must not forget that Bonn itself is not clean and pure. There are ministers and many officials whose past is dubious, to say the least. He, as well as other critics in Germany and abroad, criticized the distinction made by the German leaders, notably Adenauer, between the allegedly small group of Nazi criminals, fanatics and sadists who allegedly took over Germany and committed crimes against the will of the German people, and the civil servants. According to this myth formulated for a national purpose, part of the process of nation building, professional civil servants, diplomats, lawyers, and economists were not tainted by the Nazi crimes and should not be blamed for the atrocities. This concept was fully adopted by the leading figures of the Ministry of Justice, as shown in the study. State Secretary mentioned here, Walter Strauss, who together with the first Federal Minister of Justice, Thomas Deller, developed the new federal ministry, related to lawyers who worked in the Nazi era and continued to work in the new ministry as apolitical civil servants. They allegedly helped to draft laws without having to bear direct political responsibility. The question of responsibility of the civil servant in general and the lawyers in particular bring me back to the Chancellor's office. The superior of Karl Friedrich Werlein, the economic advisor whom I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, was the State Secretary Hans Globke. Globke, the leading figure in Adenauer's chancellery, was his close, most trustful advisor and one of the most powerful political figures in West Germany formative years. For critics of Adenauer's administration, the attitude towards the past, the campaign against Globke symbolized the struggle against the uncritical integration policy. During the Third Reich, Globke was a high-ranking civil servant as a lawyer at the Ministry of Interior. He was the author of the anti-democratic and racial regulations, particularly concerning the legal status of the Jews. He was mainly known as one of the authors of the official legal commentary to the Reich citizenship law that was part of the Nuremberg laws and defined who could be classified as Jewish. After the war and during the 50s, Globke claimed that he was an anti-Nazi. He argued that his interpretations of the Nuremberg law saved the life of thousands of the so-called Mischlinge, half-Jews. Adenauer rejected any political attempt, any pressure to keep Globke from his political power because of his dubious role in National Socialism administration. The relationship of trust and kinship between them undoubtedly influenced his unreserved support for Globke. However, it seems that standing firmly on Globke's side represented Adenauer's principled position, which he presented from the beginning of his term. Adenauer argued that the people who served in the Nazi regime should not be harmed under two conditions. One, that they were not directly responsible for acts of violence against innocent people, and second, that they show loyalty to the democratic principles of West Germany. His opponents emphasized the significant role of the people like Globke in implementing the racial policy and the final solution. The legal expert prepared the alleged legal framework for the illegal acts. Eichmann's lawyer, Robert Servatius, emphasized this point during the Eichmann trial. He argued that while Eichmann is on trial, those who operated behind the scenes hold key positions in West Germany bureaucracy today. In Adenauer's eyes, the bureaucracy reflected the majority of the German society that supported and cooperated with the Nazi regime, as is usually the case in totalitarian regime. Hans-Peter Schwarz, Adenauer's biographer, wrote, and I quote, that it was rare to find among the fellow politicians close to Adenauer's, just as it was rare to find in the general population those who showed opposition to Nazis or those who were persecuted by them and whose situation worsened as a result. Judged as lawyers who during the Nazi era were responsible for Indeed, Globke's behavior during the Third Reich was not fundamentally different from that of many bureaucrats who faithfully served the government. In many cases, their actions were not less problematic than those of Globke. Still, their position in the Federal Republic did not put them in the spotlight, and there were no political or other benefits to their removal. Hence, no one bothered to deeply investigate their actions during the Nazi era or to persist in public campaign against them. Then that brings us back to the Ministry of Justice. Jurists like Globke, who were involved in racial policy, continued their career in the Ministry of Justice of the Federal Republic. The career of Franz Massfeller, for example, senior jurist in the Reich Ministry of Justice, and later in that of West Germany, is really a prominent example. His activity in Nazi Germany was similar to that of Globke. Moreover, he even took part as a representative of the Ministry of Justice in two follow-up conferences of the Wannsee Conference on the implementation of the final solution, in which Eichmann was the chairman in March and October 1942. His activity was not a secret in the Ministry of Justice in its early years. A demand by the Association of those who were persecuted by the Nazi regime in 1952 to fire him and to prosecute him was rejected by Minister Deller on the ground that the accusations were unfounded. After that, this was ignored until East Germany published it in early 60s. Although he was not forced to leave, he retired in 1963. However, 5 years later, his contribution to the Ministry of Justice was acknowledged by its directors regardless of his actions in Nazi Germany. My last point is undoubtedly one of the most problematic issues regarding the judiciary in the Federal Republic in its formative years: the continuing function of ex-Nazi judges. By the end of 1959, West Germany democracy was highly embarrassed by East Germany's publications targeting prosecutors and judges who served during the Nazi regime and were still serving in West German judiciary. They listed hundreds of the so-called the blood judges, West German judges and lawyers who were responsible during the Nazi regime to death penalties in the spirit of the Nazi ideology. Many of them served in the so-called special court, the Sondergericht, in the people court, the Volksgerichtshof. In West Germany, they served in all levels of jurisdiction, including high judicial court and even in trials of Nazi criminals. The Ministry of Justice led at this point was the minister Fritz Schäfer, tried to downplay the phenomenon's scope. They even claimed that many of the accusations regarding the shameful and the criminal behavior of the judges and the prosecutors are without foundation, but this did not reduce the internal and the external criticism. So I'll move to the end of the lecture. In his book, The Republic of Fear, Republik der Angst, historian Frank Bies described the gradual and slow process in West Germany towards the end of the 50s and the first half of the 60s to confront the past. Bies called it the return of the past. He distinguished, however, between a small group of journalists, writers, researchers, and jurists, the spearhead of an in-depth examination of the past events, and the majority of the public who prefer to avoid it. Thus, I'll end my lecture emphasizing the important role of a new generation of jurists, public prosecutors in various parts of the Federal Republic dedicated to bring Nazi criminals to justice. They were inspired and supervised by senior public prosecutors such as Erwin Schüle, the first director of Ludwigsburg, and of course Fritz Bauer, the district attorney of Hessen. In an interview with an Israeli journalist, Schüle described the transformation of the first 11 young lawyers who came to Ludwigsburg from all over Germany, and I quote, "They came with mixed feelings," that he wrote, "like many Germans who did not want to know about the past. But when they began to understand the horrors of the Nazis, they worked without hesitation and with all their heart."